Hello, my name is Anna Vick, and I'm doing a presentation today about out-of-district placement, falling under the umbrella of least restrictive environment policy and special education. However, I do want to focus in on the idea of placing students outside of the school district when it is determined that the school district cannot meet the needs of the student for a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So this is my concept map. I've included my references over here in these little boxes. You can see that they're stemming out from references right here. But I'll begin by talking about the research. So right here is my research, and coming out from here we can see that I've looked into different academic journal articles discussing some older and some newer resources talking about the idea of out-of-district placement. So out-of-district placement is when a school district works to provide education to a student with significant needs, oftentimes being major behavioral challenges or behavioral or emotional support needs. That's one of the things that I've seen the most in my practice when it comes to out-of-district placement. And eventually the school district and the parents, the IEP team, comes to a determination that the school district is unable to provide free, appropriate public education within the district with a least restrictive environment setting. Therefore, the school district instead compensates by giving payment to reimburse parents for placing their child in a different facility or private school. These things can be different. The options are different. There could be a day treatment facility. There could be a private school for students specifically with autism or another situation or disability. There are a lot of options, but out-of-district placement has a major narrative behind it, in my opinion, so I want to talk through that. So first I'll say that I read some research surrounding rural districts, and the research talks about how educating students with significant needs, oftentimes behavioral, can be very costly and challenging for the districts. Talks about how especially rural districts often don't have options for placement for these for students who have these needs. So maybe districts go more quickly to an out-of-district placement option if students demonstrate need and the district is under-resourced. Rural might not have many students at that level of need and therefore simply places the student outside of the district. One benefit of out-of-district placement policy is that when this placement is determined appropriate, students are brought together from a broad area, especially in this rural situation, all together in one place to receive the support that they may need. A study going by states in the United States looked at up to 30% of students with autism placed in separate settings. And that might not be a private placement. Some of these could be district settings, but these would not be the general ed setting. So pretty restrictive environment there. Might take a look at McQuain, some research here writing about out-of-district placement even back in the 1980s, talking about how determination of placement is subjective oftentimes. The decision can be tough to make. There might be many different opinions involved, schools, districts, teachers, looking at the liability of a situation and the narratives told that way. Definitely going into that a little bit here when I go through story told. But determination of placement can be subjective. Interestingly, I read some research 2013 talking about how the age of the child, the family income, and the social skills of the student oftentimes influence placement decisions when looking at out-of-district or private placement settings. The results of this research indicate that older children with a higher family income and lower social skills are more likely to obtain an out-of-district placement, but the information that I pulled from that is particularly interesting was the fact that higher income families oftentimes receive more out-of-district payment or placement, and I wondered why that might be, so I'll talk about that a little bit. Definitely also conflict is a big part of out-of-district placement. This might result in litigation if schools believe that out-of-district placement is appropriate and parents don't, or if parents believe that out-of-district placement is appropriate and schools don't. This oftentimes can go to due process, and this might be very costly for schools, for families. One of the connections that I made as I was considering some of the bigger frameworks for these policies is whether the reason that higher income families seem in this study, it indicates that they obtain more more frequent out-of-district placement is because they may have the means or even the expertise to reach out for consulting and talk about litigation and talk about due process, whereas maybe a family with a lower income wouldn't consider that as much of an option, and therefore might not obtain that out-of-district placement. That's just a theory of mine. I'm not sure about it, but I've been thinking about the connection between this research and some of the ideas about high conflict. So, taking a look at the stories that are told, thinking of this from a big picture perspective, the idea of out-of-district placement says to me, when I think about it, that some students should not or cannot be taught in the public school system. Those are both stories. I tend to see in my own practice that I think out-of-district placement can be jumped to too quickly. I think that schools or teachers get tired or give up because they're not sure how to help a student, or they're struggling with a family that might be litigious in pursuing out-of-district placement. And I've heard decision makers just say, okay, let's just give it to them. So instead of trying every intervention possible to support a student in a less restrictive setting, they may jump more quickly to out-of-district placement simply because it seems the easiest course of action. I have observed that, and I do think that has to do with a backstory here, or the idea of some students should not be taught in the public school system. So when we're thinking about stories with winners and losers, I'm wondering here if the students sometimes may end up being the losers. Maybe there are resources in the public school setting and being a more rounded gen ed population that the student could have taken advantage of, and if an out-of-district placement decision is made too rapidly or for the wrong reasons, the student may lose out here. And obviously that's not what we want. That's not right. So something for us to think about as we look at the narrative behind this policy for out-of-district placement as an option for school districts. The idea that sometimes students cannot be educated by schools, that schools determine we cannot educate the student, we cannot work with the student because of X, Y, Z. It reminds me of the spring reading in the deculturalization book that I'm working on for the history class, talking about the philosophy of segregation, and we've talked about that in this course as well. Makes me wonder if there's any kind of commonality here, although we're talking about disability rather than ethnicity. Oftentimes the story that might be told in these situations is that private placement is best for the student, and that is not necessarily always the case either. But I do think these are the stories that we tell ourselves. In addition to this, the idea of higher income families receiving more private placement according to this research study in 2013, I don't think any policy, I don't think any policy or decision maker would say that higher income families should receive more private placements, but it appears that these decisions are being made consciously or subconsciously. Interestingly, as this could be a story that's being told, maybe even subconsciously or in a more covert way. And absolutely unfair to not offer the private placement to whatever student it's an appropriate placement for, if that is determined by the team, that it truly is the best fit for the student. That should have nothing to do with income, but the research does indicate that income can be a factor here. So looking at the research, we looked at the stories told. I want to look at the problems that created a policy like this, the option for out-of-district placement, tuition compensated by the district. So one problem is that some schools struggle to resource if students have high needs, especially talking about these rural districts, but really in all districts. Not all schools are equally resourced, and I think of the wall reading talking about the two different districts in New York. Even though these schools and districts were so close together, we see that they were not equally resourced, and they did not have the same opportunities for students in one as they did in the other. I think this can be a factor in supporting students with significant needs, whether they be behavioral or otherwise, and with a decision for out-of-district placement makes me think of this article and the difference in resource that might be available in one school versus another. Educators may not be trained or prepared to handle significant behaviors, resulting in further escalation. That's a problem. And then especially for rural districts, the resources may be scarce. And parents may take litigious action regarding placement. And time-consuming thing. So I do think that it has an impact on the student, on families, on schools, and that it oftentimes can be avoided by better practice. And we'll talk about that when I'm looking at solutions. Thinking in the big picture, the solutions to these problems are oftentimes costly private placement or avoiding litigation, a solution to avoid the litigation through providing the desired placement. As I said, I have seen that happen before within my own district. The instruments for this policy, I would be thinking about the funding and the authority to make these decisions, the funding to provide placement in an out-of-district school. The idea of a solution being to send the student away to a different place. Obviously, at times, an out-of-district placement is in the best interest of the student, but I oftentimes think that this decision may be made when it is not, in fact, necessary or ideal for the student. The ground rules of these decisions would be, if we're looking through the story that I'm proposing down here, we would be talking about how private placement should be avoided when possible, but given when it's quote-unquote easiest. So if private placement appears easiest for everybody, it should be given. That would be the ground rule of the narrative that I'm describing, which I obviously disagree with, but I do see this going on sometimes, so I'm talking about this based on some of the research that I've read, especially this study from 2013. In addition, we're talking about, with the problems, now we've looked at the solutions, the goals of this policy, I think, is to find something that works for students when public schools can't seem to, quote-unquote, make it work. That would be a goal of the out-of-district placement policy. We talk about a goal to avoid costly litigation and a goal to achieve free, appropriate public education for every student in the least restrictive environment, even if districts can't offer it. These are good goals. These are important. I do think that the idea of not being able to make it work is oftentimes the conclusion might be jumped to. But this right here is a good goal, and it's a good idea for every student. At the end of the day, I do have a question here about, do districts think that private placement might be less costly than litigation and therefore select private placement for certain families? And that comes from the ideas that I talked with down here. An idea that a student cannot be educated, or an idea that private placement is a good way to avoid litigious situation, even when private placement is not necessarily the right choice for the student. I have my references listed here. I'll blow those up a little bit. And that is my presentation. Thanks for your time.